It's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce Bonnie Kime-Scott. One of the reasons Bonnie is here is because of the work she did on reconfiguring modernism and on her book, The Gender of Modernism. As a graduate student in the 1990s, at first I thought I was going to write my PhD thesis on Samuel T. Coleridge, Baudelaire, and Byron. And then I said, no, I want to work on women writers. And so that's how I wound up working on Juna Barnes, Gertrude Stein, Kay Boyle, Natalie Barney, Anais Nin. And Bonnie's work was really important to me. And I know she's a name that you all know, so we don't really need to introduce her. But let me give you just a little bit more information. Bonnie worked at the University of Delaware, and then she worked at San Diego State University. And so she started off working on Joyce, then she was a pioneer for bringing questions of gender to modernism. And since then, she's been working a little bit more on environmental questions. She has a current book project called Taking Place, which is about taking places. And as we've discussed, her interest is very much, moving towards questions of environment. So please help me in welcoming Bonnie Kime-Scott.
Bonjour toutes et tous. J'aimerais remercier vivement la Société d'études modernistes et ERIBA pour l'invitation et l'opportunité de vous parler d'aujourd'hui. Cela me donne l'occasion de réfléchir aux différentes phases des études modernistes, y compris ma propre participation aux discussions antérieures et projeter ma pensée dans le futur, mettant au point le concept des réseaux. C'est un plaisir pour moi de visiter ce site ancien de l'éducation et la côte de Normandie avec son histoire sédimentaire encore très résonante de nos jours. Et maintenant, en anglais. My thanks to a friend who lives locally who went through that with me. My engagement with modernism dates back to high school, where I first read one of James Joyce's Dubliners stories. I picked up a copy of A Portrait of the Artist as a young man and began reading it on a bus bound for an exciting weekend away. Thoughts of the weekend receded, and I nearly missed my stop. I encountered Woolf on my own. She never appeared on a syllabus at any level of my formal education. Sitting on the floor in my college library stacks on a rainy afternoon, I started reading To the Lighthouse and was similarly unable to put it down, despite an approaching dinner hour. What impressed me with both Joyce and Woolf was their ability to represent the mental world of an individual, their stream of consciousness, a figure taken from nature that readily flows into a discussion of networks. Both these modernists will figure centrally in today's talk. And let's see, how do I find it?
There we go.
There's a brief outline. I always try to do too much in too little time, so these are the areas that I'm going to try to cover in my talk. I'm going to talk about networking right in the studies of modernism for a while. I'm going to talk about its metaphorical power. And then I'm going to move on to concepts that take us a little bit into some other areas. We started out talking about people and how they networked, and now I'm going to talk about other than people and how there are networks there. And we've touched on this in some ways already this morning. One of the ways I get out of control with timelines is I keep thinking about what I've just heard, and I will do a little bit of that. Already with Woolf, I had flown by the nets of canonical masculine modernism of the day. Her women thought differently, connected differently, coped with human relations differently. They were well worth knowing better. Joyce had been remarkable initially for representing the consciousness of a Nison's little boy as he experienced the sounds and sensations of the world around him. I would later enjoy the mental world of Leopold Bloom and the way he networked Dublin with his footsteps. Both authors immersed me in the everyday, a remarkable modernist trait and one with unpredictable connections. Closing out my college years, I wrote an honors thesis on James Joyce and Virginia Woolf titled "The Luminous Halo," a phrase taken from her depiction of an ordinary mind on an ordinary day in the essay Modern Fiction. As we track the random atoms of experience impinging upon the mind, are we not constantly engaged in a process of netting, connecting, and relating? Networking the new modernist studies, as they've come to be called. Modernist studies were declared new well into a process begun in the early 1980s. In his essays, Origins and Effects of the New Modernist Studies, Mark Walliger finds the term in use by at least 1994, when the journal Modernism Modernity first appeared. The Modernist Studies Association held its first annual conference, titled The New Modernisms, in 1999. Its conference regularly supported interdisciplinary panels, explored queer modernism, investigated modernity, and arenas for modernism on a more global or planetary scale. Participation in feminist roundtables was a stimulating experience in the early days, facilitating networking between generations of modernist feminists. However, in their selection of articles and forums, early editors of Modernism Modernity continued to favor Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and a male modernist canon promoted by scholars such as Hugh Kenner. This is borne out in some of the responses to Walliger's survey of MSA presidents, editors, and past presidents of the organization. Susan Frieden did not share in the general opinions to some extent. While all but one past MSA president, who was Frieden, failed to see a problem with the diversity of gender, it wasn't until 2017 that an online accompaniment to Modernism Modernity offered the journal's first forum related to feminism and women modernists. In that same year, Cassandra Laity, a former editor, launched Feminist Modernist Studies. Since 2014, female editors of Modernism Modernity have achieved a better balance, and more is expected of its latest editor, Anne Fernald, or at least I expect it. Forums for the new modernist studies have also fallen short in networking with scholars of color, and especially in the U.S., securing international participation, which I'm very pleased to see at this conference. Indeed, the Société d'études modernistes joins the British Association for Modernist Studies, founded in 2009, and other organizations situated in Australia, Asia, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. This suggests the importance of localized nodes in the expansive network of modernist studies today. We have a challenge to make more of these diverse global or planetary locations, inviting and sustaining more of them, even as various diasporas have created new nodes for connecting. We have also to tap the full potential of the virtual network occasioned by the COVID pandemic, but persisting in new and highly desirable ways, including your virtual conference last year. And that's the only way I've encountered conferences in the last 4 years, I must say. Sean Latham and Gail Rogers offer a useful survey of the new modernist studies that invokes networks in their 2015 book, Modernism, Evolution of an Idea, one chapter bearing the title Networks. Their description of this evolution invokes images of expansion facilitated by networks. They note, quote, an ever-expanding network of nodes, connections, and genealogies among multiple axes as modernist studies move beyond its traditional situation in departments of English. As they put it, quote, the rise of gender, ethnic, and cultural studies, postmodernism, new Marxisms, media history, and new historicism unwound the cables that bound together the high modernist canon. This discriminatory axis, the discriminatory axis of high-low has also been brought into question, and modernism has entered a longer time scale, extending its range to include more female participants, some of these highly successful, and I think these of these is ones in its early days. While the experiential and the new had once focused upon form, the content of new modernism better articulates the politics of gender, race, and sexual identification. Among the representative works of New Modernist studies cited by Latham and Rogers are Rita Felsky's 1995 study, The Gender of Modernity, and my sequence of critical anthologies, The Gender of Modernism, which appeared in 1990, and its sequel in 2007, Gender in Modernism, New Geographies, Complex Intersections, where the subtitle serves as an illustration of a diversifying field, even in its focus upon gender politics. Subgenres not previously cited in my talk include manifestos, leftist and socialist content, sentimental modernisms, narratives of passing, and anti-colonial consciousness. Networks and related figures. My own entry into the discussion of networks employed the figure of the mesh, taken from Woolf's observation into the lighthouse, that, quote, one's perceptions, halfway to truth, were tangled in a golden mesh. Other related figures, some strongly associated with traditional feminine work, include weaving, braiding, and the web, which I like to attribute to the spider and even to the Spider Woman of Native American traditions. For the title of their groundbreaking 1990 ecofeminist collection, Irene Diamond and Gloria Femin-Orenstein chose the title Reweaving the World, The Emergence of Ecofeminism. Additional figures might include matrix, hybridity, intersectionality, and complex. Such terms have been especially useful in discussions involving women of color. The net has diverse associations, some suggesting positive means of connection, others evoking an instrument of entrapment, be the victim a wayward coiffure, a butterfly, or fish sought for dinner. Woolf's mesh helpfully collects perceptions. The figure of the network was evoked widely in modernism and feminist work of the late 1980s and 90s. Maud Ellman titles her 2010 study of Henry James, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Sigmund Freud, The Nets of Modernism. She reminds us of Foucault's statement that, quote, networks both empower and disempower. And she chooses as an epigraph from a portrait, when the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. A second, more organic Joycean quote she favors comes from the Proteus episode of Ulysses, where Stephen Dellis evokes this, quote, strand entwining cable of flesh, the human navel, or the mystical omphalos. Focusing largely on psychoanalysis, including the tangle of dream work, Ellman finds that modernist writers confront the entangled nature of the self caught in the nets of intersubjectivity and intertextuality, both very significant connectors. Networking serves powerfully as a metaphor to explain relationships, describe urban structures from tram lines to sewers to electrical and telephone lines, as well as connections to and within nature. The neural networks that communicate information to and from the brain, the bond between animals and humans, emotional attachment to landscapes and flowers, or the phenomena of rhizomes and fungal networks carried out by plant life, ranging from mushrooms to trees. Indeed, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari are widely cited for their evocation of rhizomatic networks in 1,000 Plateaus. Modernists favor other metaphors besides networks, of course. Modern mechanical devices, whether a printing press or an automobile. And I like this new book with objects of modernism that I just received this morning. The palimpsest, a digging down through layers of history, which I have found useful in my recent study of place. I have also argued that natural imagery persists among modernists, and its study contributes to a greening of modernism, and I find quite compatible with modernism, that I find quite compatible with modernist notions of networking, and well worth extending in this talk. Carolyn Levine, your previous keynote speaker, refers to Bruna Latour as a research on networking in her 2015 book, Forms, Whole Rhythm Hierarchy Network. Latour revises our sense of networking through an interdisciplinary ethnographic approach to scientific method. His 2005 work, Reassembling the Social, An Introduction to Actor Network Theory, extends the definition of an actor to include other than human beings, and reassembles a vast array of associations. As an ethnographer of science, he values the assembling power of the sciences, bringing scientists together, vetting their work, networking in search of facts, as a skill that has been less present in the social sciences. His model navigator of terrain, interestingly, is the ant, a humble example of his revision of whose habits of cooperation count in our sense of the social. By studying the methods of these diverse actors, including the formats they use, we enable the sciences to inform the social. Latour focuses first upon the local rather than global networks, later connecting these nodes of interaction. Of interest to our modernist focus is that Latour has long challenged concepts of modernism and postmodernism, most notably in his 1991 study, We Have Never Been Modern. The modernism he challenges springs from the Enlightenment and its valorization of humans whose supposed rationality places them above other beings, justifying their earthly domination. Human and particularly male domination was also supported by erecting the subject-object dichotomy. Regarding modernity in his 2021 Kyoto lecture address, Latour refers to Galilean cosmology and a shifting of scientific consciousness outside the world to entertain remote concerns. His alternative re-engages scientists with the world, including most recently the twin challenges or controversies of viruses and virality evident in the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis. I would argue that cultural modernists of the long modernism, and particularly the women of modernism, anticipate his critique and reorientation in many ways. The gendered hierarchical duality of the subject-object dichotomy, like other binaries, has long been challenged by feminists. Though literary modernists did show considerable interest in science studies of their day, including botany and physics, their focus was often upon earthly, everyday phenomena. My takeaway from Latour, and I am not a skilled reader of philosophy or the ethnography of science, is that we are called upon to identify vast new numbers of participants, exploring and connecting beyond the traditional focuses on the masculine, the West, and remote cosmologies, and getting back down to earth. All of this is compatible with the revisionary work of the new modernist studies and, I might add, eco-criticism. Okay, now a little bit of history of my own invocation of networks. And do I hit this to get to the next? Yes. What a mess. I firmly believe that the best work I have done as a scholar has taken the form of collaboration, a networking of colleagues, each with specific standpoints, insights, strengths, and knowledges. My first diagram of a network is titled A Tangled Mesh of Modernists, and appeared in the Gender of Modernism. It shows an alphabetical array of authors included in that work, with their names in uppercase letters. A second set of names, represented in lowercase, are additional authors, patrons, and publishers, often enablers, with whom they are connected. The illustration came about in my effort to write a general introduction, and the lines are based upon one or more of my contributors making a connection in their section of that work. So I didn't come up with all these tangles. It's the fault of my contributors. It's the sort of image that one can dwell on for a long time. And in fact, it's been republished more than anything else that I have ever done. You can notice particularly who is connected to whom and how many lines of connection a given writer has. Latour suggests that networks should take the form of stars with radiating lines of connection, whereas my scheme is indeed a tangle. In a comparable project, he might have used actual sites of exchange, salons, locales such as Paris, Harlem, Berlin, Bengal, and London, publishers, or the Postal Service. The chart bears out some of the expectations of high modernism. Pound, Eliot, and Joyce do have a lot of connecting lines, but so do Woolf, who was both author and publisher, and perhaps surprisingly, Mina Loy, Rebecca West, and May Sinclair, this last who made a point of enabling younger writers. Virginia Woolf's concept of an outsider society is apt here, suggesting both a lack of connection and the potential to connect quite differently within, among its members and institutions. Numerous lines connecting women writers manifest this. There is a presence of Harlem Renaissance writers in this network, but the connections are circumscribed, with Nancy Cunard and H.D. better connected than most through diverse engagements. Cunard edited Negro Anthology, and H.D. involved herself in the production of the interracial film Borderline. A stronger emphasis upon French venues and connections would provide a more numerous set of connections representative of the welcoming milieu African Americans such as Jessie Fawcett experienced in Paris. Paris also was intimately connected with other European centers less frequently accessed by Anglo-American actors. Importantly, the Left Bank was a haven for lesbian society and their modernist collaboration, whether in Natalie Barney's Salon des Femmes, the Stein-Toklas establishment, or the bookshops of Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier, a topic memorably introduced in Sherry Benstock's Women of the Left Bank and Andrea Weiss's Paris Was a Woman. The map of Paris they offer, street by street, features these locales or nodes in the web of connections. Were I to redraw the diagram today, and my younger daughter Heidi has helped me think about this, I might move away from the alphabetical array and toward a better clustering of the outsiders. The original diagram is also not sensitive to the importance of a given connection. My late husband, a neuroscientist used to mapping taste spaces in the brain, urged me to go three-dimensional, but that was beyond my imagination and technical capability, and still is. The networking potential of the neuron stays with me as a basic natural form, and we will return to it very briefly. I have indulged in other diagrams. For a later article on Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield, I tried an illustration in which each of them became a node, and their connections or literary influencers were arrayed around them. Many individuals in that display are shared by the two authors. In this diagram, thicker lines depict a substantial connection. So I didn't go 3D, but I went wider. D.H. Lawrence, for example, is a more substantial connection for Mansfield than for Woolf. The hospitality of Ottoline Morel is important to both of them. The second anthology, Gender in Modernism, New Geographies, Complex Intersections, elicits a Venn diagram that represented the more diverse interdisciplinary concerns of the New Modernist studies. Complex and Intersections in its title, however, suggests the continuing relevance of networking as a concept. Networking in Modernist texts, New Considerations. As reflected in this history, modernist networks have most commonly been explored in an effort to establish connections among people who produced modernism, whether they be authors, patrons, editors, or publishers. What we might now consider is representations of networking that go beyond the human within texts. To what extent are modernists sensitive to the other-than-human actors that Latour considers in his exploration of networks? Do human characters connect with animals in a form of networking? We might also look at ways modernists represent the functioning of the mind. Do they sense a network even hinting at the function of neurons there? Finally, what about modernist landscapes, plants, flowers, and trees? How sensitive are they to plants' mutual networks and links to human observers? Let us probe these three areas. First, some modernist representations of dogs and a token cat. Animals have become an area of increasing interest in New Modernist studies. As early as 1985, Margot Norris was investigating beasts of the modern imagination in a book of that title. Environmental attuned feminists, such as Caroline Merchant and Donna Haraway, have noted that, like women, animals have been dominated in the cultural hierarchy favoring males. Haraway evens this out in her memorable study, When Species Meet, published in 2008. In a column written in 2009, Why Animals Now?, Marion DeKoven suggested that this interest reflected a moving from androcentric humanism to post-humanism. She sustained this interest with a study of Woolf's dog, Flush, and Gertrude Stein's Basket in her 2020 essay, Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein, Two Modernist Women Writing as Dogs. Canines were a part of Virginia Woolf's childhood experience, and she repeatedly makes an effort to understand their sensibility and their relationships with humans. They were a form of loving exchange with Woolf's intimate friend Vita Sackville West, who gave Woolf her spaniel Pinka and created a doggy persona for her, Poto. Animal nicknames, and Woolf has a vast menagerie of them, may have eased intimate conversations relating to sexual desire or served in satire, in both cases serving an immediate network. As I have argued previously, Woolf considered animals mindful, a distinction that was lacking in Victorian representations giving priority to qualities such as loyalty and capacity to love. A dog from her childhood shag figures in a eulogy Woolf wrote in one of her earliest collected essays, A Faithful Friend. The title betrays a lingering Victorian value in dogs, their loyalty. Shag is notable for finding his way back to the family home several years into exile. The young Woolf poses some thoughtful questions about the relationship between humans and their dogs. She considers it an impertinence that we should buy them for so much gold and silver and call them ours. On their domestication, she questions humans making, quote, these wild creatures forego their nature for ours, which they can but imitate. But imitation is a mental achievement. Shag's successor, Girth, was a walking companion for Woolf once she was living relatively independently in Bloomsbury. She senses his desire to get outside and run off leash and copes with public responses to the independence they both seek. Dogs are regular figures in Woolf's novels, repeatedly accompanying young women as they move about the city independently. For today, we will content ourselves with the role in Orlando and the biography of Elizabeth Browning's dog, Flush. Both works maintain Woolf's affectionate connection to Vita Sackville West. At various stages in her long life, Orlando retreats from disappointments with humans to seek out canine companionship. As a young man living in the 17th century, he gains solace from romantic difficulties and literary disappointments by seeking out his dogs of that era, elkhounds. Sensing Orlando's dislike of the dismissive poet Nick Green, one of these dogs obligingly bites him. As a Woolf, Orlando, like Sackville West, has a cocker spaniel named Pippin, whose company is preferred to the aristocrat she must endure. While the narrator recognizes dogs' own characteristic actions and responses, particularly as they interact with humans, the narrator identifies a major limitation that supposedly sets them beneath humans. They wag their tails, they bow the front part of the body and elevate the hind. They roll, they jump, they paw, they whine, they bark, they slobber. They have all sorts of ceremonies and artifices of their own. But the whole thing is of no avail, since speak they cannot. Actually, I know a dog that lives with my daughter and her wife that has all sorts of vocabulary, depending on what Aluna wants to do at the moment. Flush demonstrates dogs' capacity to adapt to changing situations and to collaborate with women in their struggle with the patriarchy. Flush lives in 3 different environments, starting with a rural existence at the home of Miss Mitford that she shares with her difficult father, Both dog and woman are released from paternal influence as they walk the surrounding fields, with Flush rushing about somewhat wildly off-leash and in the company of other dogs. Wolf imagines his olfactory delights. Capable of empathy, he has, quote, excessive appreciation of human emotions and shows a wildness half in sympathy with Mitford's delight at the outdoors. Relocated to the invalid Miss Barrett's bedroom and to walks on a chain in London parks, Flush perforce adapts. Using his capacity to smell and feel his environment, he whiffs kitchen smells and human odors, including distasteful cologne. As with Miss Mitford, Flush expresses empathy for his person and finds that he has qualities in common with Miss Barrett, particularly as he adjusts his attitudes to hers. He becomes hypersensitive and reacts timorously to Barrett's controlling father. They discover mutually their similarity. As they gazed at each other, each felt, here am I, and then each felt, but how different. Broken asunder, yet made in the same mold, could it be that each completed what was dormant in the other? Adaptation continues as Flush must respond to the rivalry posed by Mr. Browning when he comes courting. Eventually, he helps them conspire against the patriarchy, making a node of 3. Flush finds another more liberated environment when the couple moves to Italy. Released from the cultural hierarchies of England, Flush enjoys associating with mongrel dogs and is free to pursue a sexual relationship of his own. To the distress of Stephen Dedalus in the Proteus episode of Ulysses, dogs range freely on the beach he is traversing. He takes reassurance from the fact that he has a walking stick with which to fend them off. But despite this timorousness, his tendency to wander into similes and elusive asides, Stephen is a keen observer. He watches defensively at first as the dog approaches and withdraws, but then notes what amounts to a dog's networking, both with other creatures and with its presumed people, a pair of cockle-pickers. Their dog ambled about a bank of dwindling sand, trotting, sniffing on all sides, looking for something lost from a past life. Suddenly he made off like a bounding hare, ears flung back, chasing the shadow of a low-skimming gull. The man's shrieked whistle struck his limp ears. He turned and bounded back, came near, trotted on twinkling shanks. He spends some time relating to the couple as he, quote, reared up and pawed them, dropping on all fours, again reared up at them with mute, bearish fawning. We have these same behaviors in several authors in this paper. He stopped, sniffed, stalking round, brother nosing closer, went round it, sniffing rapidly like a dog over all the dead dog's bedraggled fell. Though admonished with a kick for this activity, he moves right on to piss against a rock and root in the sand. We get more of a dialogue. In the next episode, Calypso, where we find Leopold Bloom conversing with his cat, who speaks his own dialect, recorded in the unique spelling, cow. I'm not sure I can say it. Oh, there you are, says Bloom, entering into the dialogue that persists throughout the episode. Indeed, Bloom may communicate better with his cat than he does with his human partner, Molly Bloom. Bloom admires the cat's, quote, lithe black form. To his inquiry, milk for the pussins? The cat responds with a longer utterance, which requires an R as its second letter. To his mind, cats are superior to humans in some aspects. They understand what we say better than we understand them. Bloom also respects the unique capacities of cats, like its ability to jump as high as he is tall. He isn't entirely consistent in this estimation, at first refuting that cats are stupid with the sort of evidence just cited, then teasing his cats for fear of chickens. Never saw so stupid a pussins as the pussins. The cat responds with an even longer utterance, boasting of 2 R's. The cat later conveys its desire to go outside, which Bloom negotiates, declaring that the pussins must wait till he is ready. As I have detailed in previous works, Juna Barnes offers us one of the most comprehensive modernist archives of animals, which she prefers to call beasts. Many of these evoke interspecies imitation and communication, often in the service of a feminist critique considered the gender hierarchy of male over female and the assignment of women to nature. This joins her interest in intermediate positions of gender and of race. A loving gaze is exchanged between Wendell Ryder and his animals, perhaps more loving than the interactions he has with his two wives in the novel that bears his name. To add to our language of networking, there is a great deal of stitchery in Barnes, reflecting her own love of medieval patricies depicting animals at the Cluny Museum in New York. Women depicted in her works are often doing needlework, knitting, making lace, or using a sewing machine. She occasionally invokes a web, as in Nightwood, where Robin Vote has a, quote, slight drag in her movement, as if the past were a web about her. Barnes' own reflections of the medieval may demonstrate that the author is constantly networking with the past. Robin Vote has two significant interactions with animals in Nightwood, a book Barnes considered titling Night Beast. Attending the circus in New York City, she is terrified when a powerful lioness turned her furious great head with its yellow eyes of fire and went down, her paws thrust through the bars, and as she regarded the girl, her eyes flowed in tears that never reached the surface. At that, the girl rose up and expressed the wish to get out of there. Nora Flood, her new acquaintance and future lover, helps her flee. Like many modernist writers, Nora and Robin go back and forth between the U.S. and Paris. And here comes this passage again. It came up this morning. Like many modernist writers, in the final chapter of Nightwood, Robin enacts a ritual exchange with Nora's dog, constituting a further connection to Nora. The dog has tracked her to a derelict rural church in Nora's American homeland. Its barking from a distance startles Robin into an upright posture. We're already imitating dogs, I think. But once it is present, she bows down, as had the lioness at the circus, alarming the dog, quote, his paws trembling, his hackles standing, whining, waiting. Robin performs a series of doggy imitations, whimpering, striking against his side. He howls in misery and attempts to bite, barks and dashes about. She barks in response. Gradually they move in tandem, moving head to head and lying down. Margaret Gillespie brought attention to the same passage, and we had quite a discussion of it this morning. I like to think that maybe to some extent Barnes performed scriptotherapy throughout her life, and it didn't always take, but here was one attempt. This is trauma therapy. Is this something that permits the displacement of incest trauma and puts it into a written form or into an animal assist, we might say, in this particular passage. It's unclear that she was healed this time, and it's unclear that there weren't just a whole lot of other motivations, as we discussed this morning. Okay, the neuron. The neuron was described as early as 1837. In 1906, the Italian Camillo Golgi and Spaniard Raymond de Callao were jointly awarded a Nobel Prize for their work on the nervous system, a network they could detect from staining techniques they pioneered. In 1932, British Lord Elgar Douglas Adrian and Sir Charles S. Sherrington won the Nobel Prize for their account of how neurons transmit messages. So the neuronal apparatus was known in the modernist era, though the British award came after the publication of Ulysses and the death of D.H. Lawrence. We have already encountered a physiological image suggestive of networking in Joyce, that strand entwining cable of all flesh associated with the umbilical cord, the basic maternal network. We find an even more elaborate scheme with Lawrence and his Psychoanalysis of the Unconscious, published in 1921. Annelien Manchelin notes that Lawrence's use of biological terminology includes such terms as ganglion and plexus, and that the physics he integrates relate to electricity. He also mentions polarization, which is detectable in the electronics of cell membranes. Lawrence reports struggling with his stream of consciousness as an adolescent reacts negatively to the dark content of the unconsciousness advanced by Freudian psychoanalysis. Manchin also considers Lawrence's style rhizomatic, connecting to the third network I will probe shortly today when we turn to modernist trees. Indeed, this electrical whoops, where's my electrical images? There. And I should have showed you this wonderful image of the beast turning human or the human turning beast. And this is from the Book of Repulsive Women that was referred to briefly this morning. I take many images from that I think are really cool. Okay. Can you see this neuronal tree? Yes. That comes from my son's PhD thesis. I think that the axon with its dendrites in this illustration is strongly suggestive of the branches and roots of a tree. And nature seems to repeat over and over similar designs that are very stimulating to me. The location of Lawrence's primal or solar plexus associated with conception and maternal connection shares Joyce's interest in the navel. The second, or lumbar ganglion, negatively polarizes the solar plexus in what Lawrence deems the primary psychic activity of a human individual. He moves the upper portion of the body above the diaphragm and the development of objective consciousness later with the thoracic ganglion and the cardiac plexus. Together, these ganglia work in a complex circuit. The brain comes in last, and his description of it is unflattering. It is a, quote, terminal instrument, static, mechanical, dry, unliving, the instrument of instruments. It is not a creative reality. So Lawrence senses the electronic apparatus, but not the distribution of neurons. Would he see neurons lit up as they can now see their synapses in the brain as mere mechanics rather than the web work of the body? That said, this is very preliminary in my delving to bring my husband's field and my son's field together with mine. To conclude this talk, I should like to investigate networks expressed via reference to trees in modernist works. This is an ecological field of study that has recently aroused considerable interest, particularly with the publication of Susan Simard's 2021 book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. And we really are trying to read these other networks now, which I find really exciting. Simard directs our attention underground, where fungal threads via their underground mycorrhizal networks communicate and share with trees, providing them with minerals while the trees supply the benefits of photosynthesis, particularly carbohydrates, to them. A mother tree has numerous umbilical connections to the seedlings and young trees it has distributed in its vicinity. Lacking this, the seedlings planted after loggers clear-cut a forest often fail to thrive. In a work abounding in Native American traditional knowledge, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer adds that trees communicate via pheromones, hormone-like compounds, wafted on the breeze. Trees in distress send alarm signals to other trees that in turn develop their chemical defenses. Healthy trees may also send carbohydrates to trees that have insufficient carbs. All this forms a web of reciprocity. She remarks that old-growth forests may seem haphazard, but, quote, this seeming chaos belies the tight web of interconnections between them all, stitched with filaments of fungi, silk of spiders, and silver threads of water. My family sheltered at an island in the middle of a lake in the Adirondacks last summer, and there were wonderful fungi bursting from the earth in that wet soil all over the place. This is coral fungi. How close do modernists get to this remarkable sylvan network? Though I cannot to date find networks of mycorrhizal threads in modernist soil, representations of roots and branches can suggest connections and even networks. And humans definitely form vital connections to trees, even as they do to animals. Trees are implanted in many modernist texts, even when they are urban in location. We know that both Lawrence and Wolfe were introduced to botany by their fathers. Lawrence's parent was familiar with both fungi and wildflowers of the region, which is not far removed from Sherwood Forest of Robin Hood fame. Wolfe went botanizing with father in Cornwall. Joyce arranges for forest nuptials in Ulysses. A pear tree figures centrally in Catherine Mansfield's Prelude. Jamie saw her life as a great tree and comes to a sexual and spiritual awakening as she watches bees plunging into the blossoms of a pear tree. In Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And in that work, Native Americans can read the approach of a hurricane in the behavior of the sawgrass. Juna Barnes was born in a log cabin on Storm King Mountain, situated on the scenic northern narrows of the Hudson River in New York State, which introduced a sylvan element to her bizarre childhood. Barnes was an illustrator as well as a writer, and orchids as fungi represented an intermediate species of interest to her. When we first meet Robin Vogt in the arboreal titled Nightwood, she poses among potted plants, exotic palms, and cut flowers, as if she is merging with them in a deliberate reconstruction of woman's relation to nature. The chapel of Robin's final scene is set in the woods. But I will rely on Wolfe to conclude our exploration for today. More than one of Wolfe's characters is inspired by trees or identified with them. Lily Briscoe balances her painting by moving a pear tree to the center. Early in the waves, Lewis thinks himself as a yew tree. My hair is made of leaves. I am rooted in the middle of the earth. In a moment of anguish, having attempted to comfort Lewis with a kiss, Susan lies down on the roots of beech trees in the garden. Consoling her, Bernard suggests that the children visit the forbidden neighborhood estate with a magical name Elvedon in a ringwood with a wall around it. They notice the ferns smell very strong and that there are red funguses growing beneath them. But let us focus on Mrs. Dalloway in Orlando. As I've argued elsewhere, Mrs. Dalloway has a sense of holism that embraces both the people and the landscape she has experienced. Quote, somehow in the trees of London, on the ebb and flow of things here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other. She being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house here being laid out on the mist, like a mist between people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist. Septimus Smith receives communications from trees, some quite beautiful. The excitement of the elm trees rising and falling, with their leaves alight and the color thinning and thickening from blue to the green of a hollow wave. They beckon to him, and he seems to take on their language and gesture, quote, the leaves being connected by millions of fibers with his own body. There on the seat, fanned it up and down. When the branches stretched, he too made that statement. Trees also disclose the horrors of war and personal loss that are devastating him as he hallucinates his dear friend Evans emerging from behind a tree. We delve deeper into Earth with the battered old woman who stands beside a water source, perhaps a rusty pump opposite Regent's Park tube station. This is presumed to be the remnant of an ancient spring. Sing a song of the ages. Though it issued from so rude a mouth, a mere hole in the earth, muddy too, matted with root fibers and tangled grasses, still the old bubbling, burbling song soaking through knotted roots of infinite ages and skeletons and treasures, streamed away in rivulets over the pavement and all along the Marylebone Road and down toward Euston, fertilizing, leaving a damp stain. In Wolfe's Orlando, the central character works for centuries on the poem The Oak Tree. On her estate, a grand oak, and this oak isn't grand, it's American white oak near my new home in Maryland. On her estate, a grand oak stands uphill overlooking the landscape, which, together with the heath more generally, is owned by various branches of Orlando's family tree. I would put the word owned in quotes because I suspect the author questioned such possession as she had the ownership of dogs early on. While we do not find a network between this potential mother tree and others in the area lying down beneath it, Orlando felt, quote, the earth's spine beneath him. Orlando repeatedly grounds him herself by retreating to the oak. In this case, he ties his heart to it as he lies beneath a tree on a summer evening, quote, all the fertility and amorous activity of summer's evening were woven web-like about his body. Trees are strewn throughout Orlando. The hero's strange transformation to heroine is witnessed by a naval officer perched in an appropriately named Judas tree until the branch breaks and crashes to the ground. Orlando mounts a donkey under a fig tree, strolls in a nut grove, sits beneath a willow, meets a young woman under a plane tree, and rides with her lover's shell through a dark wood. For her country home, she plans to buy flowering trees. Elms and oaks line her entry drive. In the final pages, more than 300 years after the book opens, Orlando tries to describe connections, quote, in the back of her brain, associations of a lifetime. At first, she seems to be delving into a pool. In it is the ferny path up the hill where she walks. This is also the Serpentine in London. The series continues, and everything was partly something else. And each gained an odd moving power from this union of itself to something not itself, so that with this mixture of truth and falsehood, her mind became like a forest. The path, of course, leads to the central oak tree of the text, which is still thriving and sustaining this sense of network. My final trees stand at Monk's house. They're the trees that Leonard and Wolfe dubbed Leonard and Virginia. We can't see the roots of these two trees, but their bare branches suggest networks. They weave together one another, reminding us of the Wolfe's mutual networking for modernism and of all those people who did the people connections early on. There's thanks to my two kids who helped in this, and thanks to just a whole network of terrific workers before me. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Bonnie, for bringing your work on networks into some new ideas and new ways to conceive of those. And my cat Tiger thanks you for your presentation.
Token cat.
Yeah, Token Cat, thank you very much. I'm sure you've got some questions for Bonnie. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, thanks so much. That was fascinating and wonderful and enlightening, and I'm just so enamored by your presentation. Would you mind talking a little bit more about those networks that you made yourself, those visual representations that you shared with us at the beginning? I thought they were wonderful and so helpful in visualizing these interconnected networks.
You know, what would really be fun someday is to look back, and, you know, I was getting regular requests, can I republish this and this and this? But I never looked up how they got reused, because that extends the idea. And there was lots wrong with that first, mess. But it really did stimulate people to do more things. And that, to me, is the most satisfying aspect of it. And I think that digital humanities has become such a huge development. And one of the set of people who've been interested in that dumb first diagram are people who do digital humanities. And I didn't know I was doing digital humanities, but it seems they've imported it as part of that. So I think that, to me, is one of the most satisfying things. But I would love to hear if anybody else has done anything, to diagram modernism in similar ways, because I like to learn from giving talks, too.
Well, I didn't do it myself, but if you're familiar with Alfred Barr's work at MoMA in the 30s, right away I thought of, and I was kind of tweeting along while you were talking, and I talked about how especially the first diagram, really made me think of his own cubism and abstract art chart. If you have a chance to check it out, I really recommend it because you'll see the parallels, and it's really this wonderful way of being able to kind of grasp things in a very concrete way when we're really wandering around in these abstract concepts. So your work and then as it connects to Barr's chart are incredibly wonderful and helpful. So thank you.
But that never would have come about had there not been collaborators that were interested in collaborators that brought out modernism. Thanks.
Hi, that was super funny. Just a couple of thoughts, really, because you were asking about other people that have done that kind of work, and it reminds me that quite a bit of work has been done on kind of periodicals as networks that I think has been done as digital humanities type projects as well as kind of more discursive things. So I know that the the MJP website that was Bob Scholes set up all those years ago. There's a section of it that has got a lot of data analysis type thing, lots of lovely coloured diagrams. But you can see easily why a magazine is already a kind of network.
Yes.
And then it's the links to other publishers in other or other contributors to other ones. So that was just a thought. And then just finally, I think your tree at the end reminded me, and I'm sure you thought about it, but just the tree at the end of Howard's End. If you had any thoughts about that, because it's really central. We think about it as the house, but I think it's quite an interesting, kind of proto-eco work of modernism, Howard's End, in many ways. But he really focuses on the tree in the garden there. So I'm not sure if you thought about it, but if not, it's something to go and think about.
There could be a tree book in my future.
Indeed.
And I think one of the refreshing things about the poetry worked on this morning is all those natural images and these systems we don't yet understand, but at least modernists had curiosity about them. And I think increasingly there are all these efforts. What are whales saying to each other? There's a whole system of communication and language there. Well, we're doing scientific approaches to understand what probably is a humanistic endeavor amongst whales. I don't know how to describe it exactly. But we can learn. And the scientific theories that said nature was all about competition and survival of the fittest are being overturned when you think about a plant providing carbs to one that needs them and one photosynthesizing to one that can't. And one early plant, this may be lichens, which came out of in poetry this morning, may be breaking down rocks to provide the soil that lets ferns come in next and so on, that there's a web of cooperation that's just waiting out there to be tapped and understood and perhaps imitated instead of competition in this world of ours. Mm-hmm.
So this is just a follow-up comment to that, actually, with both in Donna Haraway's most recent, I think it's Staying with the Trouble, where she cites "We Are All Lichens" as the ways which, and they've actually discovered recently that lichen is not a dual organism; it's a triple organism, actually.
Yes.
But there's also been a lot of renewed interest, especially in some more activist, new materialist fields in Kropotkin and the mutual aid as emerging from sort of a reinterpretation of Darwinism, which is also happening right before sort of all of the modernist works that you were talking about. And I don't know if there's a direct link between mutual aid and anarcho-syndicalism and some of these modernist circles, but that might also be something that's kind of interesting to delve into.
Robin Wall Kimmerer, the Braiding Sweetgrass author, of course, is a Native American and is recuperating these traditions that were denied people for so long, including their language and words for nature that we don't know and they've largely lost. But I think it's very interesting that she started with mosses and what helped enabled them in this whole web of connections. I can't recommend that book too much. It's nice short vignettes that all fit together and increase our access to Native American wisdom. And Native wisdom the world over understood the plant world far better than, I suppose, the people who came in and decided, oh, we can plant crops and have our apples here and around the world and so on. And that's probably overstepping modernism. I'm going off into this eco stuff.
Sorry, we're recording this.
Seeing you in person, real life, but I was just interested in the fact that, like,
Biljana will please speak now.
There's another person over
hear
there.
me? Sorry, thank you. Thank you for your talk. It's great to actually meet you in person and talk to you. I was just wondering if you could comment on the fact that on that network again, there are only like 4 or 5 women.
Which network?
On the one that, the picture, you know, there are only like, I know, there are only 4 or 5 women writers, right? And the fact that, you know, it's like very few women.
There are more than 4 or 5.
I'm sorry, the whole...
Well, Wolf, I can't see very well.
Mansfield, Mew, Moore,
Wells,
Reese, Richardson,
West,
Sinclair, Stein, Warner, West.
I
I
can't
mean,
see.
just about all the capitalized ones are women.
Oh, okay, I couldn't tell.
I wish it could be bigger, but I think that's the... And you can
there's
see the
Lars-
words coming through the back of the page. I don't have the
Well, of course,
original.
there's just fewer women, you know, there's like very, very few.
Well, even in the enablers, although that gets tricky, there were strings attached to female patron of things. I don't know, we could do a count, but I think there are lots of women up there. It's been part of my mission.
Well, can you comment on that, about your mission as far as women modernists are concerned?
Isn't it interesting that Virginia Woolf was never on a single syllabus I had as a student? And it was Edward Albee's writing Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf that said, I got to find out, why should I be afraid of this woman? And that's why I was in those library stacks at Wellesley all those years ago. I think, what woman poet did I have? Maybe 1 or 2 poets in my whole education, but everything else was men.
Dickinson?
But I'm old. Or I don't like to admit it. But.
Yeah, was it Dickinson? Let me repeat that.
It was Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, yes. And I'd heard of others, like Frankenstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. And it's very interesting that you started with the idea of new modernisms and of integrating other points of view, and that you showed this diagram also because one of the things that it seems you also were part of inventing at the time was a diagram that had, and it's true for all of your diagrams if I recall correctly, nothing in the middle. Before that, you had the pound era. You had someone right in the middle, and then the others would be around. You would have these very specific center to periphery kind of dichotomies that still exist today, but it's very interesting to see how your diagram does not imply this idea that there was a center and then there were some marginal ones. There are, of course, slightly bigger names and slightly smaller names, but they're all to the sides. And it's very interesting to me because it reminds me of the fact that, and I'll go back to your question this morning, that new media at the time in the 1910s, 1920s were based on structures that were extremely central. In Ulysses, in the Aeolus chapter, the first, if I remember at least one of the first titles is Omnium Gatherum, which is a joke on Latin talking about the fact that the newspaper is at the heart of Dublin. It's at the junction of every tram lines, and that all the tram lines converge to this particular place of power, where also the newspapers and then the radio would have their place. And networks of media at the time were centered around places of power. The BBC was the place that was the center that broadcast to the rest of the world. And I think that modernist artists were very aware of that and thought about how to get things to the margins. In Ulysses, you have this moment in the Circe episode where Elijah comes in and he says, I'm operating all this trunk line. I'm at the center of all the telephone cables. And this figure, Derrida analyzes that in Ulysse Gramophone, this figure devolves into a casino boy playing, toying, saying, faites vos jeux, les jeux sont faits, etc., and opening up this network that was one-sided with a center and periphery into a whole constellation. And I think there is a diagrammatic revolution in modernist studies that I feel you were part of, and that has a lot that is faithful to something very deep in modernist arts.
Good. I think I never, when I was in college, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a diplomat, an astronomer, or somebody who went on in English. And I can't get over those other things, wanting to keep combining all of them. And I think that's part of this diagramming thing. And then, of course, I've had all these neuroscientists in my life that added their own ideas. And that's stimulating. It really is. It goes on. But I think some of this, the colonial centers, we may have had a big central British Empire, but out there in the colonies, they did their own little networking. I think Levine points this out in some of her work, that we have systems that are within the systems, but are also pulling away from it in interesting ways.
Can we connect your really brilliant idea about modernist networks with one modern literary theoretical idea of world literature? Literature beyond Western canons, beyond these borders typical for literature. Can we connect this? Can we connect these two ideas?
I think I'm gradually informing myself about non-Western ideas. I've been, this place book, which may or may not find a publisher because I'm trying to be popular and academic at the same time, and I'm not sure publishers like that. But I've deliberately tried to delve into Southern Africa, and there we have multiple colonizing forces, and considerable survivors of, the kind of mythological backgrounds, and forms of prophecy and so on that are totally non-Western. And I have a long affection for India. First went there in 1965 as a student for a summer and never got over it. And India is this wonderful thing where you think of all the flows of influences from so many other parts of the world. I think that's what makes that culture really so rich. And I don't think I could ever do it justice, but I have an India focus in one of my places as well. And I think Rebecca West got me into Black Lamb and Grey Falcon. We talked about that at lunch. I mean, there's so much there. And appreciating just sort of different takes on the world that you get through travel. Yes, I'd love to come to Bulgaria someday. I've had some, and this is a while ago, connection to Hungary, as I mentioned to you. But yes, I think it's a privilege to immerse oneself in traditions other than one's own. And we have been very much dominated by very few centers of control. I think the current situation with Russia and Ukraine and the control of media is, again, a fascinating thing. And then we talked about retweets and Twitter this morning. Certain people can get pretty influential that way as well. Okay.
Are there really no more questions?
Okay, on to both of
Okay, Coffee and Museum. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed putting together.